Imagine a continent being carved up, almost like a cake, right, by outside powers.
Yeah.
Then, just a few decades later, those same powers are, well, retreating, and this huge wave of independence just sweeps across the land, reshapes the whole global map.
A massive transformation.
That's the story we're really diving into today, the decolonization of Africa. We're looking at this pivotal, enormous shift in global power. It profoundly changed an entire continent, mostly in the mid-20th century, 50 through the 70s mainly.
Yep.
So our deep dive today, it's an exploration of this incredible process, the dismantling of European colonial empires, and then the emergence of independent African nation states.
Yeah.
We want to unpack not just how it happened, but why, and maybe most importantly, its really complex, lasting impact. We've looked at quite a range of sources for this, taking us through the history, the drivers, the different ways freedom was achieved, and those challenges that definitely followed.
And understanding this period, it's not just academic history.
Yeah.
It's absolutely crucial, I think, for getting a handle on contemporary global issues, the geopolitical landscape we see right now.
Yeah.
And just the ongoing stories of so many nations. It's really foundational for understanding our interconnected world today.
It really is staggering when you stop and think about how this all began, the sheer audacity. To really get decolonization, we first need to understand what was being decolonized. And that story for Africa, it really kicks off with the Scramble for Africa.
Right.
And that key event, the Berlin Conference, 1884-85, European powers literally sat down with a map.
And just drew lines.
Exactly. Arbitrarily partitioning an entire continent. Just think about that for a second. They drew these lines, completely ignoring existing ethnic groups, languages, cultures.
Everything on the ground, basically.
Yeah, this wasn't just map making. It was like the ultimate act of social engineering on a continental scale.
Yeah.
It created nations almost designed for future conflict. A slow-burning fuse, really.
And what's fascinating, or maybe disturbing, is how those arbitrary lines then dictated a specific kind of colonial rule. It was deeply exploitative.
How so, specifically?
Well, it wasn't just about borders. It was a whole system built on intense economic exploitation. Think raw materials, forced labor.
Like taking stuff out.
Relentlessly. And political subjugation, obviously. Social hierarchies were imposed, indigenous cultures suppressed, any limited development. It almost exclusively served colonial interests.
Not the people living there.
Never for their benefit or for the future of those potential nations. The continent essentially became this giant resource extraction machine for Europe. And it was systematically denied the chance to build its own industrial base. So this wasn't just underdevelopment. It was, a deliberate structural dependency designed to last.
Trapping them.
Yeah, trapping new nations in that cycle. Export raw materials cheap, import finished goods expensively.
The impact of that kind of rule over decades, it must have permeated absolutely everything.
Oh, absolutely. And those impacts were deep and long-lasting. Those artificial borders we mentioned, they directly led to states crammed with diverse, sometimes hostile ethnic groups.
Which inevitably caused problems later.
Huge problems. Tragically, you see it in countless post-independence conflicts. Civil wars, ethnic violence, Biafra in Nigeria, Rwanda, Burundi, the Congo. The roots often trace back to those lines on the map.
And was there also a policy of actively setting groups against each other?
Yes, the classic divide and rule. If you connect this to the bigger picture, you see how colonial policies deliberately sowed those seeds. They'd empower one group over another, creating resentments that just festered for generations.
It's hard to see how nations emerging from that could easily find a unified path.
Exactly.
So, given this deep-seated colonial system, what finally started to shift things? What pushed these massive European powers out?
Well, one of the biggest single factors was probably the weakening of the European powers themselves after World War II.
Right, the war took a huge toll.
A massive toll. Economically exhausted, huge human losses, and their global priorities just shifted completely. They were focused on rebuilding at home, and then boom, the Cold War kicks off.
Maintaining vast, expensive empires just wasn't feasible anymore.
Not sustainable, and maybe not even desirable for many back home. They lacked the resources, and arguably, the political will started to fray.
And that power vacuum, presumably, allowed space for movements within Africa to grow.
Absolutely. You see the powerful rise of nationalism and Pan-Africanism. Crucially, you get the emergence of Western-educated African elites.
Leaders we still know today.
Exactly. Figures like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Senghor in Senegal, Patrice Lumumba in Congo.
They could articulate the demands?
Yes, they articulated potent anti-colonial feelings and demanded self-determination, using the language the colonizers themselves understood. And Pan-Africanism was vital too.
How did that play in?
It was an ideology promoting unity, solidarity among African peoples. It helped foster a shared identity, transcending those colonial borders, and inspired liberation movements. Think of the Bandung Conference in '55, a key moment.
You also mentioned the Cold War. That seems like a really complex factor. How did that influence things?
Hugely influential, though complicated, as you say. Both the U.S. and the USSR were locked in this global ideological battle.
Seeking allies, influence.
Precisely. And they strategically supported decolonization movements, partly to expand their own spheres of influence. It's a fascinating dynamic.
Because the U.S. was allied with colonial powers like Britain and France.
Right, but publicly they championed self-determination. Meanwhile, the USSR presented itself as the great anti-imperialist force.
Did that rivalry cause problems in Africa too?
Oh, definitely. Unfortunately, sometimes this superpower competition fueled internal proxy conflicts in newly independent states, added another layer of tragedy and complexity.
So global politics played a huge role. What about international organizations? Did the UN have teeth?
It certainly had influence. The UN Charter itself, affirming self-determination, gave a kind of moral and legal weight to the anti-colonial cause.
A framework.
A framework, exactly. Yeah. Plus, the UN had its trusteeship system for some territories. And then a really landmark moment was General Assembly Resolution 1514 in 1960.
What did that do?
It was the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. Basically called for an immediate unconditional end to colonialism.
Strong word.
Very strong. And there was a committee to monitor it, and even UN peacekeeping missions involved in some transitions, like the Congo. It raises an important question, though. How much did this international pressure really accelerate things versus just giving existing movements a bigger stage?
It feels like it must have provided a powerful, legitimate platform for African leaders to use internationally.
No doubt. It amplified their voices significantly.
And were they also looking elsewhere for inspiration? Like Asia?
Yes, absolutely. The influence of Asian decolonization shouldn't be underestimated. India gaining independence, other nations too.
Showed it could be done.
Exactly. It provided a clear model, encouragement, proof that colonial powers weren't invincible.
So, a confluence of factors. But you said the path wasn't the same everywhere.
Far from it. It's really important to stress that decolonization wasn't this uniform, monolithic process. It varied wildly across the continent.
From peaceful handovers to, well, war.
Precisely. It often depended on the specific colonial power and, crucially, whether there was a large population of European settlers.
Okay. Settler colonies were different.
Very different, usually much more resistant. So you had countries like Ghana in '57, Nigeria 60, Tanzania 61. They gained independence largely through negotiations with Britain. Relatively peaceful, constitutionally driven.
Relatively being the key word, I imagine.
For sure. Still complex politics. But then contrast that with places like Algeria, a brutal, devastating war against France until '62. Kenya, the Mau Mau rebellion against Britain, intense conflict, severe repression, independence in '63. Later on, you have Angola and Mozambique fighting Portugal until '75. And Zimbabwe's struggle against white minority rule, backed by Britain initially, went on until 1980.
Wow, much later. So decades of difference in experiences.
Absolutely. Decades and vastly different levels of violence and trauma.
You can see that timeline clearly with some key dates. Libya was actually first post-WWII from Italy in '51.
That's right. Often overlooked.
Then Ghana, first in sub-Saharan Africa from Britain to '57. And then that explosion in 1960, the year of Africa.
17 nations. An incredible moment.
So what does this all mean for the diverse experiences across the continent as it moved towards self-rule? It sounds like independence, while a victory was just step one.
Step one of a very, very long and difficult journey. Political freedom was achieved, yes, but it left behind this incredibly complex legacy.
Let's unpack those challenges. Politically, what were the immediate hurdles?
Well, those arbitrary borders we keep coming back to, they remained. And they continued to fuel ethnic tensions, leading to civil wars.
Like Biafra.
Biafra in Nigeria, yes. Rwanda, Burundi, Congo. The list is long and tragic. Secessionist movements, too. And the institutions left behind. Often very fragile.
Weak foundations.
Very weak administrative and democratic structures. Plus, there was often limited indigenous experience in actually running a state because colonial powers hadn't allowed it.
Which opened the door to instability.
Yes. Many new states struggled to establish stable democracies. Military coups became common, one-party rule. And then there's that shadow of neocolonialism.
Explain that a bit more.
It's basically continued influence, often economic, by former colonial powers or other external actors. Through aid with strings attached, debt, political interference. Independence wasn't always truly independent.
It sounds like political independence didn't automatically mean economic freedom either.
Not at all. Economically, the challenges were immense. Remember that dependency on primary commodities.
Right. Exporting raw material.
That continued, which left economies incredibly vulnerable to global price swings. It really hampered diversification, industrialization.
Yeah.
They were stuck.
And debt.
Huge issue. Many nations inherited debts or quickly accumulated new ones, which just crippled their ability to spend on development, education, healthcare.
And governance issues internally.
Sadly, yes. Weak governance, lack of accountability. It often led to corruption, mismanagement. Resources meant for development got diverted. And you still had that shortage of skilled professionals, thanks to the lack of colonial investment in education. A huge human capital gap.
That's a daunting list of economic challenges. What about socially, culturally?
Well, those ethnic divisions, often worsened by divide and rule, kept fueling violence. And there was a real struggle to forge a unified national identity when strong tribal or regional loyalties remained powerful.
Hard to build a nation from such disparate parts.
Very hard. Language was another barrier. The imposition of European languages often sidelined indigenous ones. And beneath it all, just widespread poverty, poor health care, limited education access.
Yeah.
These problems persisted long after the colonial flags came down.
It's fascinating, or rather sobering, how the foundations laid during colonialism just kept shaping those post-independence struggles. Like the problems were baked in.
In many ways, yes. It created a deeper, sometimes more insidious form of dependency, even after direct rule ended.
Okay, so stepping back from the immediate post-independence struggles, looking at the longer term, what's the enduring impact? What does this all mean for the world stage today?
Well, the most obvious legacy is the sheer number of new sovereign states. It fundamentally changed the global political map.
And the UN membership exploded.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
Giving previously unheard voices a platform. At least in theory, many of these new African nations also joined the non-aligned movement.
Steering clear of the Cold War blocs.
Trying to, yes.
Yeah.
Asserting their autonomy. It was a powerful statement. But, as we've discussed, the ongoing struggles of nation building showed that political independence didn't automatically equal economic or social liberation. That struggle continues.
But there were efforts towards unity within Africa.
Definitely. You saw strong Pan-African unity efforts leading to organizations like the Organization of African Unity, the OAU.
Yeah, the African Union, the AU.
Exactly. Aimed at promoting cooperation, tackling shared challenges, and overall decolonization just fundamentally altered international relations. It gave a significant, much-needed voice to what we now call the Global South.
It really is an incredible, complex, and absolutely vital piece of modern world history we've been discussing.
Absolutely.
From that arbitrary carving up of a continent to the incredibly varied, often painful journeys towards independence and nation building. And the echoes are still felt globally. It's a huge testament to resilience, isn't it?
It truly is a story of agency, immense struggle, and, ongoing evolution.
So as you listening reflect on this deep dive, maybe consider how that legacy of decolonization, those borders, the economic structures, the social dynamics, how it continues to shape current events, global power balances, often in ways that aren't immediately obvious. How does understanding this history maybe change your perspective on the interconnected world we live in today? And perhaps, how does it challenge some assumptions about why certain global challenges persist?